Support for this episode comes from Such a Match, a new podcast of Jewish love stories from Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California. If you enjoyed our miniseries on Jewish weddings, you'll love listening to Such a Match, where you'll hear stories from real couples who met and married after meeting the old-fashioned way, in a Jewish newspaper's personals ads back in the 90s and early 2000s. From stories about hilarious blind dates to moms who play matchmaker, you'll also get the real story about falling in love, navigating the highs and lows of marriage, and the truth about lasting love. You can listen to Such a Match wherever you get podcasts, beginning January 21st. A brief note before we begin this episode. It was recorded many weeks before it was released publicly, meaning our conversation took place before the ceasefire agreement that was widely reported on January 15th. Initial reports indicate a multi-phase ceasefire agreement, including a release of many people, Israelis and Palestinians, who will be able to return to their families and homes. We celebrate this de-escalation of violence and hope that it endures. We continue to hold deep hopes for a brighter future for Palestinians, for Israelis, and for their loved ones around the world.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 466, Israel-Palestine, an American Jewish Discourse. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are kicking off a series of episodes. I actually think of it as a continuation of a series of episodes that we've done on essentially the way that North American Jews relate to Israel and Palestine. We're not geopolitics experts, so this isn't really a podcast to talk about geopolitics. This is really a podcast about Jewish life in the world. We're in North America. We're actually in the United States, so that's what we know best. And yet, of course, this is a dominant issue in our time. Before we jump into that conversation, just wanted to make a last advertisement for a wonderful Yeshiva class. If you remember, our guest last week was Vanessa Oakes, and she is teaching a class in the Yeshiva called Jewish Ritual Lab, Experiments in Jewish Creativity and Invention. It has had its first meeting, but you can still register. So just go to judaismunbound.com/classes. And if you register, you'll be able to get a video of the first session. You can catch right up, and you're not going to want to miss a chance to spend 2 more weeks live with Vanessa Oakes. Financial aid is available, and we really hope you'll join this amazing class and that you'll stay tuned for future Yeshiva classes, which are all amazing experiences. So now let's jump into this conversation, Lex. I wanted to start by hearkening back to the series, and I looked when we last did a long series of episodes about Israel-Palestine. We actually have done a few scattered ones here and there, but we did this long series, and obviously this is something that we've all been thinking about very intensively over the last year. So I wanted to just remind myself and remind you of my 2 takeaways from our last series of episodes about Israel-Palestine, the ones that have really stuck with me. One, let's not call other Jews anti-Semites. Let's just have that as a ground rule. It would be really nice if we could just imagine, which I think is generally true, that Jews love other Jews, love Judaism. To call them anti-Semites is to misuse the term anti-Semite. Maybe seems like a basic takeaway, but unfortunately it's not. And we have heard a lot of Jews calling other Jews anti-Semites over the last year. So I want to kind of reground us in that as a starting position. And the other one, in my view, was that we should have conversations with thoughtful people, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with their starting position in the conversation. Because in a deep way, I'm really committed to the idea that comes from the Talmud. There's this famous story in the Talmud that talks about why the law ultimately, or the Jewish tradition ultimately, is decided generally according to the view of the House of Hillel, which was one of these competing schools of thought. And it says that even though the House of Shammai's ideas were also from God, the House of Hillel prevailed because they were often translated as gentle and humble. B'nai Lappi recently has been translating that as something like flexible and could take a punch, and that they would study their own views and study the views of Shammai, and that they would articulate Shammai's views before articulating their own. It felt to me like from that series of episodes that we did on Israel-Palestine that we talked to a number of people who tend to be not invited to typical Jewish places. And that felt really sad to me, because even though I may not have agreed with what people were saying, I found them to be really thoughtful people that are worthy of engaging and that have changed the way that I think about things. So I'm excited to kind of pick up on that series with those two principles.
Yeah, I'm excited for this unit too. I mean, maybe I'll move, not that I don't also have takeaways from that past unit, but maybe I'll just sort of situate us now. I'm torn in multiple directions, and I think productively, between the ways in which North American Jewish life has had a serious change to our communities. Like, and for me, by the way, I don't talk about that as just October 7th. I would talk about it as October 7th plus ongoing violence since then. And a lot of that violence channeled towards Palestinians. Talking about it just as October 7th, I think, is actually a choice. And when we do it, we center that day, which was predominantly about the loss of Jewish life. Tragic, terrible, irredeemable loss of Jewish life. And for me, I'm not just talking about that, which happened, a year and a few months ago, but also the period since then. So there are things that have absolutely shifted. I don't want to pretend that's not the case. Communities that have been split, new communities that have arisen in a lot of different political positionalities, individuals that have felt in large numbers alienated from spaces, digital developments, offline developments, creative art. All of this has happened. And a lot of the dynamics we're seeing with American Jews and our relationship to Israel-Palestine have been long underway. And what's happened the past year is not a directional shift. It's an increase, an amplification of trends, of debates, of splits that were already underway. And that actually reminds me of a lot of our conversations about COVID. I don't say this with joy, but we felt in the early days of COVID, 2020, 2021, we were a little skeptical that certain things were going to eternally shift around digital Judaism and people's relationship to it. But we really did feel like certain realities were going to continue for at least many years. And digital Judaism that had been sort of denormalized and stigmatized would become more normalized. Now, I do think that's been partially true. But we've seen, even in the last couple years, that things that happened during the early days of COVID very quickly retreated. And the quantity of creative programs online available to people drastically decreased after a period of increase. And so that was a teaching for me, because I was really ready to see that as like, this is an eternal shift, and Judaism is different now, because I think this serves a really important role in the ecology of Jewish life. It taught me, like, okay, even when things are seismically huge, Israel-Palestine violence is among the most seismically huge conversations. COVID is among the most seismically huge conversations. Even when that is the case, there's incredible power to inertia, to the way things have been. I'm torn because I think there are certain realities that have shifted in the past year that are going to land and remain the case moving forward. I do think there is a polarization operating between, and it's not necessarily a twofold polarization. Polarizations, usually we assume of like, we're splitting to two sides. Like, I actually think there's polarizations of multiple axes happening, and some of those splits are stark enough that they may remain. And we are part of an ongoing, unfolding Jewish civilization that has had splits around Israel-Palestine for a long time, that even for decades has had people speaking out strongly against Zionism. The fact that it's happening a little bit more now, and the fact that certain institutions are buckling further into their support for Israel, that is also not just new. So I want us to not be fully like presentist. I don't know if that's the right word. I want us to not be overly obsessed with our realities of this precise moment, while at the same time cherishing and valuing the fact that actual human beings are dying daily. People remain in captivity of various kinds. Both Israelis and Palestinians remain in captivity of various kinds at this point. And so I'm offering that, and we'll be talking a lot more about that throughout this unit.
Yeah, and I guess it's valuable to mark this a little bit in time. We are recording this episode, and by the way, this is part of Judaism Unbound in general. For all kinds of logistical reasons, we generally record our episodes long in advance of when they come out. And This episode's being recorded about a month before it comes out. And honestly, we don't really know what's going to be on the ground when this episode comes out. And one of the challenges of having conversations like this is we're talking about the reality in mid-December of 2024. You're going to hear this episode in mid-January of 2025. And God willing, there'll be positive developments and there could be really negative developments, and we don't know. That's why I'm really interested in talking about these longer term questions, because honestly, I don't think they're going to change all that much. When you were talking, I was just reflecting on my youth in the 1970s and early 1980s and thinking about how, on the one hand, the amount of violence in Israel-Palestine was substantially less than what we've seen over the last year. But psychologically, it wasn't that different. The way that the Jewish community was thinking about what was going on in, when there were all these plane hijackings and there were buses being bombed in Israel, I'm talking about. And of course, there would be Israeli reprisals. And the mindset that I remember was a similar kind of mindset, a similar kind of this is just the worst it's ever been. And of course, this changes everything. And like you were saying, there were these voices within the Jewish community, organizations like Breira and the New Jewish Agenda. And then in Israel, there was Peace Now. And there was this notion that nobody could have conceived of how awful and terrible this is. And there were these notions of and that doesn't justify anything to do to protect yourself. In some ways, it feels very different today. And in some ways, it doesn't feel different. The facts on the ground are certainly different, but the psychology is less different than you would expect. And I understand why people want to say on both sides, meaning I think that there are people on, again, let's sort of call it the pro-Israel side or the American Jewish mainstream side that are something has shifted and now there's a surge of interest in Jewish participation. And now there's going to be this huge change and people are going to be supporting Israel because they're afraid of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that that is necessarily the case. And on the other side, there's a sense people are waking up to the way that Israel has mistreated the Palestinians and to the degree of violence. And the Jewish community is going to wake up and be supporters of the Palestinians. And I don't think that that's going to happen either. Now, what is going to happen? I don't really know. What I'm coming in here is to say, I'm just skeptical that anybody knows and that anybody is really able to say anything definitive, which is why I'm more interested in voices saying, well, this might happen, or this should happen, or this is the way that I'm thinking about it from a moral perspective. I'm really interested in that discourse, and I think that it's been a little bit overshadowed by a kind of a battle between poles that have definitive notions of what they think this is all about. That's actually fair. But what they think that is going to happen, which I think they actually don't know.
So I'm glad you brought up Breira from the 70s. I mean, they're often cited in conversations about sort of the legacy of Jewish voices speaking out, I would say, for Palestinian humanity. All of these, I don't want to try and hide that both of us, but that I'll speak for myself, that I do have political inclinations on this, that I am invested in organizing around Israel-Palestine, and that will come through in this unit. But so I would describe them as part of a legacy of Jews speaking out for the humanity and dignity of Palestinians alongside Jews. Others would describe them differently. But what's interesting about Breira is what that word means. It's alternative. I actually really want to bring some tochacha, some rebuke to my own comrades, my own organizers. We have to stop talking about ourselves as alternative. I love the legacy of Breira, and at the time, in the institutional landscape of the 1970s, they were, in fact, correct to describe themselves as alt, as different from the organizations, and even to a greater degree then than now, the population of American Jews. We have survey data of what people have thought about Israel and Palestine over time, and what Jews believed in the 70s, what they believe now about Palestinians, about Israel, different things. And there have been trends towards more people answering questions about having sympathy for Palestinians over time, both among Jews and among the broader American public.
By the way, I think you're making I know that you're making a deeper point, but just on the subject of Breira, just to clarify, I think that the way that the name came, was because people used to always say, "Ein Breira," there is no choice, there is no alternative.
Yeah.
We have to do this, meaning Israel has to treat the Palestinians this way. And they say, no, there is a Breira, there is an alternative. Right?
But so that's part of the deeper point. That's actually that is reactionary. Like people use the word reactionary, and it sometimes is just sort of a term of art for folks in a certain right-wing political, but that is a reactive framing. And that's the tochacha I want. Like, we keep on doing this for 50 years, and there was a real importance and place for it in the 1970s. But we actually have to look around and be like, we've got a lot of people. We've got a lot of Jews who are on board with Palestinian humanity and are invested in struggles to create a world where that humanity would be better recognized. And every time we operate in this reactive stance and say, oh, well, Jewish federations did this, so we need to say this. JCCs, synagogues are doing this. We have to create the opposing letter. The primary thing that does is it continues to ascribe authenticity, to ascribe mainstream, to ascribe real Judaism, quote unquote, to the set of people who are not fighting for Palestinian humanity. And that doesn't serve our goals. That presents ourselves as less powerful voices than we actually are. We actually have people power at this. There are a lot of people that are, I don't know what to say other than on the left on this, or that are questioning Zionism or actively not Zionist or whatever it might be. And we're going to talk about all these terms throughout the unit. They're not simple. I do think at a certain point, we have to hold the responsibilities of we are Jews who are holders of Jewish tradition and can, through our actions and practices, constitute Judaism right now. We're Judaism. Let's stop talking about ourselves as alternatives, dissenting voices. So many words of dissent. I do dissent from what a lot of our institutions say, but they're not actually the voice. They're not elected by anyone. Nobody has ever, in any official sense, inaugurated the CEO of a local Jewish federation as the voice of that population. When we respond to the words they say with, they're voicing inauthentically what the local Jews are saying, we're saying that they're a voice for Jews. They're not. They are an unaccountable, unelected person who was placed in that position by a hiring committee, not by a broad collective. They don't have an election they're looking forward to in 2 years where they have to gauge what the public thinks and respond to it and be careful. They only need to think about the things that they're accountable for as an employee of their organization, which is sometimes funders, which is sometimes a number of other things. And so I really want us to say, we're Judaism. We're not just a sideshow. And that's a scary thing to do, because then we have to carry the weight of being holders of that tradition and not sort of take the less powerful role of kvetching, which is good to do in the face of others who hold that power.
Well, so how does that connect to a lot of the themes that we've talked about on Judaism Unbound on a lot of other topics over the years? Because I think that we have generally taken that position, right? That the best way to create a version of Judaism that accords with the way that you dream that it could be is not to fight the various institutions that are committed to something else. And, we brought in the ideas of disruptive innovation very early on in the history of this podcast, where we said, look, the way that major change happens is not generally that the dominant players in the field change the way they do business. The way that the change generally happens is when something new is created outside of that mainstream for quote unquote customers who are not customers of the previous organizations, the previous companies, and they create something new. It's not as powerful, it's not as successful in all kinds of ways as the old one right now. But it is appealing to all kinds of new people who never would have had any interest at all in the old thing. And over the course of time, it has the potential to gain strength, to gain power, also to gain quality. A lot of things that are new, that are kind of fringy, meaning they take place out in the fringes, not that they're alt the way that you're talking about, but that they really are happening in a world with less resources, with less organization, with less history, tend to be messier and less maybe capable of influencing political discourse around the world, right? And we've generally taken the position that if your take on Judaism is that you don't believe in God the way that it seems like synagogues are believing in it, then start a new or spiritual community. If you don't feel that the mainstream world is hospitable to LGBTQ folks, there's Svara that's creating this whole new world of LGBTQ folks. Now, we have also always said, and of course there should be pressure on the mainstream organizations to be more welcoming to LGBTQ folks, for example. And we have said, oh, it would be so much better if there was not a set of presumptions out there about people's beliefs in God, and, you know, that people should be made to feel bad if they don't ascribe to a certain set of principles. Particularly, we've talked about that a lot in the realm of conversion, for example. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you think about this stuff, Lex, relating to Israel-Palestine, I guess my question is, are you saying fundamentally that you want our listeners to be thinking about Israel-Palestine in the same way as those other things and saying, let's just create new things that'll grow over time? Or are you saying something more complex than that?
I think I'm partially saying that. I think I'd complicate it only by saying, and I'm not saying this because you're not aware of it, but like, depending on the snapshot length of how we're looking at American-Jewish relationship to Israel-Palestine, it's like a drastically different thing. So if we take a snapshot of the last few decades, that's one thing. If we zoom it out to a snapshot from, say, 1948 to now, that's another thing. If we zoom it out to 1890 to now, that's a whole other thing. And what I mean by that whole other thing is that the first almost half of that experience is one where the predominant mainstream to which one would build alternatives was anti-Zionism, or at least not Zionist, for the first while of that. Even into the 40s, even into the period when Israel actually emerged, there were still very, very loud voices that did not believe that the best route to Jewish safety was to have a nation state. And if we zoom out to like Jewish history for thousands of years, the first huge percentage, 90+% of that time span, there was not any proactive like visions of a Jewish state apparatus. There was a relationship to the land of Israel. Very early, there were actual, kingdoms in Judah and Israel. Whether those were historically factual or whether they are more mythic is a question. How big they were versus how they're described in text is a question. But like, when we zoom out really big, what we notice is actually related to what we said at the top. We don't know what the grand vision of Israel-Palestine will be in Jewish tradition in a few hundred years, because it's constantly been ebbing and flowing and changing and shifting. As a collective, we are very challenged in envisioning anything pre the last, I'm going to throw out 100 years. That's like a made-up number, but that's our lifetime and our grandparents' lifetime, like the lifetimes of people we have known and who could have told us things about their lives. I think we struggle, unless we're like actual historians doing that research, to zoom out thoroughly. But we need to, because what we notice immediately is that there is no clear, obvious through line of what it is to be a Jew and think about Israel. I never say like Judaism stands for fill in the blank about, I don't say it generally, but like I certainly don't say it about Israel-Palestine. I believe it would be a good world if every Jew on the planet saw themselves in solidarity with Palestinians, if every Jew on the planet held love for fellow Jews and together committed to a process where we would actively partner and create a world where Palestinians have equal rights to Jews and where Jews are able to feel safe in that partnership. I don't think it is an accurate statement for me to say Judaism stands for equality. Judaism stands for the rights of all people. Like, yeah, there are texts that you can cite that do that. There are texts that you can cite that say, go to your neighbors, wipe them out en masse, presume that they hate you, and if you don't kill enough of them, go kill more. That's also there in Judaism. It's in the book of Numbers with respect to the Midianites. And I'm glad you brought up the theology question, like God belief. We do this there too. When I'm the worst at giving intro to Judaism talks, because I go into a room and I'm asked to talk about Judaism. And I say, a lot of Jews don't believe in God. A lot of Jews do believe in God. A lot of Jews, if you ask them what they think about God, say, I don't know. And that's my answer, basically. That's not a particularly helpful answer to people, because what they want is the Jewish belief of God, which is usually talked about as ethical monotheism or even just monotheism. It gives them a little more tangibility to the question. If you say, well, the Jewish belief generally is monotheism. There are also others. There are quote unquote alternatives. That's not how I talk about it, because I think that totally morphs what religions are, because they're not stories of a main core belief that people dissent from. That's actually not what's happening. There are myriad theologies that are Jewish, and some of them are monotheisms, and some of them are atheisms, and some of them might even be polytheisms. Historically, they certainly have been at some eras. My own is a pantheism. I think we have a problem where we want so badly a Jewish unity. We want this is what Judaism is, and we're kind of bound around it, and those who aren't bound around it are dissenters. I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah, well, I think that this is where you and I over the years have had a slightly different take, but a general agreement. Because I agree with you that you cannot say that there is this one thing that Judaism has always been about in an honest way. I don't think that's an honest thing that a person could say. What I think is really going on is that we have preferences. We have narratives that are moving to us about what we think the meaning of Judaism really is. And you can say that in two different ways. One is you can say Judaism has been a lot of things in the past, but I really want to move forward with a subset of what Judaism has been in the past, and to say these are the principles that I find particularly moving. Whoever wants to come along with me to this Judaism, come along. And in some ways, I think that when we've been in a constructive phase on Judaism Unbound as opposed to a critical phase, we've said a version of that. I think that there's a little bit of a twist on that I've become a little more interested in over the years, which is that we could say the thing that I find really inspiring, right, a set of ideas like love the stranger, believing that every human being is created in the image of the divine, these various kinds of principles that say, that's actually a stream of Judaism that's existed for a very, very long time. So it's not an innovation. It's a voice within the multivocality of Judaism that has been there all along, and that I want to be part of, and that I actually want to be part of that stream becoming a more powerful stream in our time. The question for me is, when we have application of that to Israel-Palestine, how does that manifest? I'll put some of my cards on the table here and say that as someone who basically sees themselves as, what used to be called liberal Zionism, it used to be called kind of like somebody who's on the left, like left of center, and that means not treating Palestinian life cheaply, right? That means, sometimes in geopolitics, you have to do things that are very destructive, and you try to minimize the amount that you need to do that, right? I mean, a set of ideas like that. I actually feel pretty homeless, right? Because I kind of feel like there is a powerful stream that more or less says the threats against Israel are too severe, that translates that into saying the threats of Jews are too severe. And I want to talk about the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. But, that kind of says, this is a very dangerous time, talks about connections to the Holocaust, and basically says, and therefore we got to do what we got to do, and we don't have time to worry about other people. Then there's another stream, though, that kind of feels like it says, we don't agree with that at all, and a reversal of that. And I think that they actually both have a right to claim, like you were saying, they both have a right to claim a Jewish provenance for what they're arguing. It's just that I think that in some ways both claim a version of this is the right Judaism, this is the proper Judaism. And that's where I go back to my takeaway from our last set of episodes about Israel. It's I don't think anybody should be blacklisted. People should just be talked to. And I don't have any fear of talking to people that I disagree with. I don't have any fear of other people hearing from voices that they disagree with. I don't think that people are so weak that if they're exposed to an idea that they wouldn't have otherwise heard, that all of a sudden they're going to be, converted to it. I think it's obvious how I feel about my friends on the right. But to my friends on the left, I would like to feel like there's an openness to the possibility that there's a reality on the ground, that whether or not you think that it was a mistake to have Israel in the first place, it's been there for 75 years. So that raises real question. I mean, it's like, it's not so simple. It's just saying, like, I don't think Zionism was a good idea.
So I think that this is a really good conversation thread to go into, because there's just fundamentally different notions of what it means for, what Zionism means, and we're going to talk a lot about that. And relatedly, what anti-Zionism means, because if you disagree about what X is and you're talking about the opposite of X or the opposing faction to X, that's going to be different too. What's funny is people who oppose Zionism, obviously they're proposing a vision of the land of Israel-Palestine that would be radically different from what it is right now, because Zionism is a reality and there is a nation state that identifies as a Jewish state, and importantly for them, which enshrines certain rights for Jews that are not enshrined for non-Jews. Now, without going into all the details of that, that's not me saying a controversial thing. That is something that the founders of Israel took seriously as part of what it meant to create a Jewish state. And it's something that when you suggest today, we should not have laws that privilege Jews over others, that people's response to that is sometimes, well, that is equivalent to the end of Israel. And I actually think that sometimes non-Zionists, anti-Zionists have a more flexible notion of they have a more flexible notion of continuity or maybe discontinuity. This gets definitely to conversations we've had on our podcast. Because I often have conversations with people where I'm like, look, I don't care if it's called Israel. I don't care if it even calls itself a Jewish state. If there are no rights available to Jews, especially Jews globally, but even Jews in that land, that are not also available to non-Jews. Call it whatever. Jewish itself is a word that we've changed the name of whatever we are multiple times. We were the Israelites, then we were Judeans, then we were Jews. And still, we are able to draw a through line throughout that. It might be a mythic through line, but we're able to feel in our bodies like we're part of a story that dates back 3,000 years, even though the people 3,000 years didn't speak the language we speak, didn't live in the places that you and I live, and didn't even use the same words to describe what they were. And yet we're able to do that. So there's people arguing for shifts to what Israel is doing and is that might be different from calling for a kind of non-existence. Some others I don't want to deny, there are people who speak about a non-existence. I'm interested in visions where we would say, okay, like you did, there's a huge diversity of people. How do we create a world that is safe for all of them? How do we create a reality that is safe for all of them, where people are not forced into exile, where people are able to live and thrive? How do we do that? I think that there are answers to that question that involve a state that is different from right now in that it wouldn't have certain rights for Jews than others. The biggest being a global right of return for all Jews, no matter where they live, that is not available to Palestinians. That's, I think, a less threatening notion than just full on, this place won't exist. That word existence gets mobilized in ways that are confusing. And I think it's confusing when everybody uses it, not just when my own political opponents use it. And so I'd rather work from a place of, okay, we're all hoping for the well-being of our fellow Jews, of Palestinians, of the world. How do we navigate that? I often think, what if, I live in Rhode Island, what if we treated participation in Jewish discourse like participating in Rhode Island discourse? If you live in Rhode Island and you have a thing that you think about this place, that there's no way somebody could look at that and be like, well, you're not a true Rhode Islander. You don't, maybe people could, I guess, but it wouldn't land very well. If you're talking about Roger Williams, the founder of this state, and saying he was amazing and created this place of religious freedom, that's a Rhode Island thought. If you're talking about him and saying he's culpable in forms of white supremacy and in terrible relationships with indigenous people that were catastrophic, you're also doing a Rhode Island thing. all of it is Rhode Island, people talking about Rhode Island. And so if you're a Jew talking about Israel in any direction, I don't know how someone can seriously say that you're like becoming un-Jewish in the process. It doesn't make any sense.
Totally agree about the becoming un-Jewish. I mean, I really think that it would be a better world. And by the way, I feel like this is something that I feel like I can advocate for uncomplicatedly, because we're the poorer for smothering or not listening to various opinions that we disagree with. And so I'm not just saying that the mainstream, or, whatever we want to call it, the old school institutions should listen to the lefties. I agree with that. But I also think the lefties should listen to the others, because if they don't, they're not going to understand why they're going to lose, and they might not lose. And that's a world that I think we live in, that people are not letting each other talk and they're not listening to each other. And I think that one thing that we have to contribute with this podcast is that we can try to do some of that, right? We can try to invite some of that. And if anybody, hears this, and how could you have let that person have a platform or whatever? It's like, no, that's what we're about, actually. That feels to me like an uncomplicated thing for me. What's complicated for me is political advocacy that tries to use collective voice as power to achieve a political end. But the question is, if you're trying to use power to achieve something and don't really have a good set of thoughts about what's going to happen on the other end of the power that you're using, that feels to me like a problematic use of power. And if the other side is doing that and they're doing it irresponsibly, your response to try to use, equal and opposite power or greater power to try to make a different thing happen than what the side that you disagree with is trying to do, I don't think that makes it okay. And I worry that what's happening on the sort of political discourse, as opposed to the moral discourse here, because the moral discourse says we should change the way that people are thinking morally. And if we change the way that people are thinking morally, then over the course of time, they will come to a better solution. But the political power discourse says, I don't want to wait for that. We need to do this now. And I am totally sympathetic to the desire to do it now, because people are being killed now. And people are being harmed and dislocated now. And there is a need for that to stop now. And yet, if you don't have a good sense of, and then what's going to happen, but your answer is a more utopian, but wouldn't it be a better world where everybody could return to their homes? That's where I'm struggling with I'm not struggling with the moral voice. I'm struggling with the practical demands in the absence of a plan sort of for the day after, as it were.
Yeah, so I think there are things we do disagree about that you just brought in. I don't want to dwell on them too much. And I think the way I'd frame them, you wouldn't disagree that harshly with. Like, I think it's important to say there are views people express that I think are abhorrent and that I don't respect. I think you would co-sign that.
Sure.
I think there are views about Palestinians that are fully, deeply abhorrent and that I don't seek out on this podcast, and that I don't think do any good in the world when they are uttered. I think there are also views about Israelis and sometimes about Jews that are deeply abhorrent. I think those views are less common in hallways of deep influence. I do think that there's a substantially bigger problem with views being expressed that actually deny the basic humanity of Palestinian people and their deservingness, quote unquote, to exist, to use a word I just criticized, to have bodily existence. Like, I think there is a bigger problem of that than those who are doing a similar thing, but towards Jews or Israelis. That said, I'm with you that the fact that I find those views abhorrent, I actually do still have to listen to those. I actually do, maybe more than others. I think we have to be skilled at hearing those views and responding to them. Now, I would not do it through our podcast, but I do it all the time in interpersonal conversations. And in terms of what you were saying about speaking in the collective name of Judaism, I mean, I think before I said very much that I'm with that. In the short term, being Judaism is this thing. Like, we live in a country that thinks religious views should be more respected than others. That's actually enshrined in our First Amendment, that if you think a thing religiously, it matters more. Now, the way I'm saying that clearly alludes to the fact that I actually have a problem with that. Like, I'm not on board with the way the free exercise clause, the notion of religious freedom. I think the ways that it's being used are deeply irresponsible. It's not that I want to revoke free exercise, but I think we live in a country that sees religion as, if you think that thing, it's kind of untouchable. If you have a religious viewpoint, then other people can't tell you you're wrong, or at least they can't enforce legally that you're wrong. And so what that means is that Jewish organizations constantly want to prove on every side that what we're doing is like the quote unquote authentic Jewish thing of it. Because if you win that battle, then people can't criticize you. And we're seeing that. What has the Jewish institutional right and center won on the question of Israel-Palestine? They have convinced enough governmental leaders that the Jewish belief, the religious instantiation of Judaism, is to support Israel. So if people are criticizing Israel in a strong way, they're actually doing something that is anti-Judaism. That has been a long political battle that the right has won. And so, of course, the left and even some in the center want to respond in that reactive way I criticized and say, no, that isn't true. But saying, no, that elephant isn't purple makes people envision in their head the purple elephant. That's the George Lakoff framing piece that we've brought up over and over again on this podcast. We have to find ways to embody what Judaism can be, and maybe in our views should be, and in its respect for all humanity. And I really think that we have to find ways to do it that don't depend on the unique power of religion, that, like, candidly, they're just going to benefit the opponents of liberation. Like, people have in their head the idea that religion, by and large, tilts conservative. When we do it over and over again on every issue, and we imply that there's this, like, platform of what Judaism is eternally, we're heirs to a lot of texts that are not what we want to be saying, and that do actually aid folks on the right. So what we have to say is, look, Judaism is established and created by everybody who is Jewish at a given time. It's actually not a lie when right-wing legislators or ministers in Israel say that the Jewish thing is to wipe out Gaza. It's not a lie. It's a horrific, terrible mobilization of Judaism that we should oppose with better versions of Judaism. But in order to do that, we actually have to name that what they're doing is Jewish, and eventually create a world where you just can't deny anymore that at least part of the grand set of messages that Judaism says is to oppose violent harm to any human being.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you about that question, some of that last couple of things that you said over the course of time. Because, for example, if somebody started wanting to slaughter animals and, sacrifice them, there's a way in which you could say, oh, well, you can't say that's not Jewish because that was part of Judaism for, a millennium. And
that's exactly what I'd say.
Well, I don't say that, though. I think that it's not Jewish anymore. It's not been Jewish in 2,000 years to sacrifice animals. Therefore, I think that you can. I'm with you in saying that I think that there's a lot of things that it's hard to say are Jewish and not, are not Jewish. But I do think that it's not everything that's ever been Jewish. And you could say it, but I also think that there's some power in saying, actually, we left that version of Judaism behind, or we want to and we should.
That opens up anybody who wants to, saying, okay, sure, Judaism abound. You want to revive Shemitah, but nobody's done Shemitah in thousands of years. So that's not really Judaism anymore. Or you want to look deeply at what the biblical calendar is and how holidays are different than what we do them now. That opens the door for people to do the same, to do all sorts of things that we oppose.
Yeah, and I am happy to open that door for them and then to have the argument, right? But I do want to be able to say the version of Judaism that I think should be the version of Judaism going forward doesn't sacrifice animals and doesn't treat Palestinian life cheaply and doesn't want to destroy Gaza. I'm comfortable saying that advocating the killing of our enemies is not a Jewish thing to do. What I think that might be valuable, though, and with all this as a kind of a closing note, is just to put on the table that there are games, and I don't mean games in the sense, like, I don't think people are doing it for fun, but I think that people are playing language games in the discourse on Israel-Palestine. I think that there's a lot of use of language as a cudgel of some kind. And, like you were saying earlier, that there are things that Israel does and things that supporters of Israel do and say that fundamentally cheapen Palestinian life and don't acknowledge the humanity of Palestinians. And I think that there's an enormous fear, whether it's a legitimate fear or not a legitimate fear, whether it's a fear that's actually being activated or not activated today, is a whole set of questions that I think we'll explore in this series. But it's really important for the opponents of Zionism to understand the fear and trauma that many Jews have about essentially the Holocaust, right? And that they have about the capacity of anti-Semitism to exist and to turn into a murderous form of anti-Semitism. And they believe, whether rightly or wrongly, that if, for example, the Palestinians had the same right of return as Jews do in Israel-Palestine, that Israel-Palestine would be flooded with Palestinians and they would want to kill all the Jews. And that fear is being manifested in a heightened use of the terminology of anti-Semitism in this discourse. And I don't like it, right? Like, I don't like the way that anti-Semitism has been thrown around so much, because I actually think it's taking our eye off the ball of the actual source of the most dangerous forms of anti-Semitism for American Jews, which is from white supremacists. What we have to understand deeply is why that's happening. And I think there's a way to cynically say that it's happening because organizations see that they can raise money from it. But I don't think that that's quite right. I think that's part of it, for sure. People out there have like actual existential fear and dread. If we have a discourse about Israel-Palestine, particularly within the Jewish community, that doesn't understand the deep existential fear and dread that Jews have, again, rightly or wrongly, then it's not really able to address the problems that we're facing. And I think there's a lot of words like anti-Semitism, Zionism, anti-Zionism, non-Zionism, genocide, apartheid, right of return. Like, there's so many words that have that capacity. And then people are asked, are you a Zionist or a non-Zionist? I'm trying to figure out if there's anything valuable that we can do in this series that maybe models an alternative form of discourse where you're not trapped using a set of words that ends up polarizing and that ends up making the conversation not really feasible. And I'm looking forward to exploring that in this series.
I think it's important to name that Jews across the full spectrum of how they relate to Israel and Palestine, most Zionist, least Zionist, whatever terminology we want to use, are motivated by fear. And I include myself in that. What you just said is powerful and true. We do absolutely need to hold the fear of those whose fear of anti-Semitic violence leads them to conclude that having a Jewish nation state is the best pathway to safety. What I don't think can go unsaid is that action after action, you've got descendants of Holocaust survivors talking about how their fear for collective Jewish safety is precisely why they're not Zionists. That having a particular one Jewish nation state in a different area of the world gives an out globally. It creates a situation where a Donald Trump and where people leading other nation states around the world can presume that the way Jews are kept safe is not actually their own responsibility. It is the responsibility of a nation state in the Middle East called Israel. And so the core thing that they need to do is actually not look out for the rights of Jews domestically, but just create a safe pathway for Jews to be able to leave and go to that other place in times of horror, in times of anti-Semitism. Because we are in a time of anti-Semitism that is rising in the United States, and because we have domestic actors who are deeply in love with Israel, like, that's actually a fear that I have that motivates my activism. Like, I struggle because I think we suggest, and I'm not saying you meant to do this or we're doing this, like, we suggest that there's this total lack of fear, this naivete that fuels the left, that they don't believe that there's any real danger. They think we can all just get along. No, it's actually the fact that we think this place creates a really easy out for people to be terrible to us in the rest of the world and say, well, you got that place that isn't here. Go there. It's not that big a deal if you're not safe here, because our job is to keep your key to the city, key to Israel open so that you can leave. So I think we should be validating fear across the board and working to overcome it and working to have our visions not only inflected through fear, because as long as they are, we're kind of paralyzed. In times of fear, I'm making a lot of Constitution metaphors, I guess, today. Like, there are actual laws that, like, in times of war, you can put aside a lot of principles. Like, that's actually part of how we determine legalities in a Supreme Court level or in any court level. Like, if you presume that everything is higher stakes, then core values to you become less core. You start to have your fear mobilize you at the expense of other things. So it's not that I'm like a pro-fear guy, but I think we sometimes miss that fear is mobilizing people across the Jewish spectrum. We all, right. I don't have direct parentage from the Holocaust, but like I have direct parentage of pogroms. I have ancestry of pogroms. I have direct ancestry of all sorts of feelings of powerlessness and marginalization. And even if I didn't have that direct ancestry, I have the collective Jewish story that I've been taught in Hebrew school and that I've received in all sorts of spaces that is important about how we haven't been treated well. So I wanted to just invoke that that's mobilizing all of us in different ways.
Yeah, and I think that understanding what you just said, I wish that will shape our discourse. Like, I'm curious how it would, right? Because I think if you understand that both sides to a dispute, and by the way, not to mention the other, the Palestinians also have tremendous fears. And I remember talking about 100%. What Israel was doing in terms of clearing out parts of Gaza in order to bomb them, that some people, would say, oh, we're doing that to protect civilians. And I remember saying, like, but you don't understand, the Palestinians' worst fear is being displaced. You're actually activating their worst fears.
Yeah, it's gobbledygook. It's we're wiping out civilians in order to protect civilians. What they mean is we're protecting Jewish civilians.
I'm just talking about, even if you accepted the argument, I'm not arguing about whether it's true or not, but I'm saying even if you accepted the argument that they were trying to displace Palestinians in order to kill the non-civilians that were there, and then they would be able to come back. Like, even if you thought that was like a kind thing to do, it actually activates the worst fears that they have, and you don't know that because you're not listening to them, right? And so what I'm imagining is, once we get to the acknowledgement that everybody's acting out of fear, to me that opens the door for a different conversation, right? Because it says, yeah, the reason why I'm nervous about what your position is going to get us killed, and you say that, well, I think your position is going to get us killed. Well, at that point, let's talk, as opposed to let's destroy each other, whether physically or politically. And that, to me, feels like an exciting possibility. I think the best we can possibly do on a podcast, on anybody, is just to model something. And I'm hoping that that's what we're going to do.
Me too. So thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. My suspicion is that our call for sending emails, being in touch with us at the end of this episode may get a few more bites than our calls at the end of every other episode. So that's great. Please be in touch with us with thoughts you have about our conversation today, about our work more generally, whatever calls to you. You can be in touch with us via Facebook or Instagram at Judaism Unbound. You can email Dan or I at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. I will now remind that we've got this amazing Jewish Ritual Lab class with Vanessa Oakes that you can sign up for at judaismunbound.com/classes, and that financial aid is available. So head there. We hope that you will dive in. And the last thing that we'll say is that we're really grateful for you traveling along with us in this unit. We're looking forward to some incredible conversations with wonderful guests. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.